The wind howled across the Dakota plains like the cry of a wounded animal. On a small hill overlooking the Oglala Lakota village, a tall warrior named Dakota knelt beside a fresh grave. His hands pressed against the cold earth where his younger brother now lay forever silent. The sun was setting, painting the sky the color of blood. It seemed fitting. There had been too much blood spilled in recent months. Too many good men had fallen defending their homes from the blue-coated soldiers who came like locusts, taking everything in their path. Dakota's brother, Mapia, had been only 22 years old. He had a wife who was expecting their first child and a little boy who called him Papa. Even though he wasn't the blood father, Mapia had taken in the boy when his real father died in a hunting accident. That was the kind of man Mapia was, always helping others, always putting family first. 3 days ago, soldiers had attacked their winter camp. It was supposed to be a peaceful settlement. The chiefs had signed papers with the white government. They had promised there would be no more fighting if the people stayed in the agreed areas. But promises meant nothing to these soldiers. Mapia had been checking on the horses when the attack began. He could have run. He could have saved himself. Instead, he ran toward the gunfire to help defend the women and children. A bullet found him as he was helping an old woman reach safety. He died with her grandson's hand in his, telling the boy everything would be okay. Now Dakota sat alone with his grief and anger. The village below was quiet except for the sound of women crying for their lost sons and husbands. Smoke still rose from burned teepees. The smell of destruction hung in the air like a curse. "Why did you have to be so brave, little brother?" Dakota whispered to the grave. "Why couldn't you just think of yourself for once?" But he knew the answer. Mapia had been raised the old way, the right way. A warrior protects his people even if it costs him everything. Their father had taught them that before he died fighting other soldiers 5 years earlier. Their grandfather had lived by the same code. Dakota heard footsteps behind him. He didn't turn around, but he knew it was his mother. She moved quietly the way she always did, but her breathing was heavy with sorrow. "The council is gathering," she said softly. "They want to hear what you think we should do next." Dakota finally stood and faced her. His mother looked older than her 50 years. The lines around her eyes had deepened in the past few days. Her hair, once black as a raven's wing, now showed streaks of gray. War aged everyone quickly. "What is there to think about?" he said. "We fight or we die. Those are the only choices they've left us." His mother studied his face.
She had given birth to 4 sons.
3 were now dead. Only Dakota remained, and she could see something dangerous growing in his eyes. "Fighting hasn't brought us victory," she said carefully. "Maybe it's time to consider other paths." "What other paths?" Dakota's voice rose. "Should we go to their reservations and let them turn us into farmers? Should we cut our hair and wear their clothes and pretend to be white men? Should we let them take our children to their schools and teach them to hate everything we are?" "I don't know," his mother admitted. "I only know that I can't lose another son." Dakota felt something break inside his chest. His mother had lost her husband and 3 sons to this war. She had buried 4 of the 5 men she loved most in the world, and now she was looking at him with eyes full of fear, knowing he might be next. "You won't lose me," he promised. "But I can't live like a tame dog either." They walked down the hill together toward the council fire. The tribal elders were already seated in a circle, their faces grim in the firelight. These were wise men who had seen many seasons of war and peace. They had guided the people through the worst times in their history. The eldest, a man named Chayton, whose hair was white as snow, gestured for Dakota to sit. "We need to decide our path forward," he said. "Some say we should negotiate with the government again. Others want to join Sitting Bull in Canada. What do you counsel, young warrior?" Dakota looked around the circle at these men who had known him since he was a child. They had watched him grow from a boy who played with wooden horses to a man who had counted coup on real enemies. They trusted his judgment, but tonight he felt the weight of that trust like a stone in his chest. "I have been thinking about something," he said slowly, "about why we keep losing even when we fight bravely, about why our enemies seem to get stronger while we get weaker." The elders waited. They could hear something important coming in his voice. "I think the spirits are testing us," Dakota continued. "I think they want to see how much we're willing to sacrifice for our people's survival." Old Chayton leaned forward. "What kind of sacrifice do you mean?" Dakota stood up. The fire cast his shadow long across the ground. "I want to make a vow. A sacred promise that will show the spirits I am serious about protecting our people. His mother felt her heart begin to race. She knew her son well enough to recognize when he was about to do something that would change everything. I vow that I will not take a wife, Lakota announced. I will not know the touch of a woman or the joy of children. I will remain alone until our people are free from the white man's control. Until we can live as we were meant to live, without fear of soldiers burning our homes or taking our children. The silence that followed was complete. Even the night insects seemed to stop their singing. The elders stared at him in shock. This was not a small promise. For a young man of 25, this was like vowing to cut out his own heart. His mother made a small sound of pain. Lakota, no. Your father would not want this. Mapia would not want this. Mapia died protecting a family, Lakota replied. He died making sure children would have a future. How can I think about my own happiness when there might be no future for any of our children? Chayton shook his head slowly. This is a hard path you're choosing, young man. The spirits may not require such a sacrifice. Then they can release me from it when our people are free, Lakota said. But until that day comes, I will live only for war and protection. I will be a weapon in the spirits' hands, nothing more. As if summoned by his words, a red-tailed hawk suddenly appeared in the firelight. The bird circled overhead 3 times, its cry piercing the night air, before disappearing into the darkness. Every person around the fire saw it. Every person understood what it meant. The spirits had heard Lakota's vow. They had accepted it. Old Chayton sighed deeply. If this is your choice, then we witness it. But know that a vow made in anger often brings more pain than the problem it was meant to solve. I'm not angry. Lakota lied. I'm focused. But as the council meeting ended and people returned to their lodges, Lakota remained by the fire. He stared into the flames and thought about what he had just done. He thought about the women in other villages who might have become his wife. He thought about the children he would never have. He thought about growing old alone. For just a moment, doubt crept into his mind. Was this really what the spirits wanted? Or was this just his grief and rage talking? Then he remembered Mapia's face as he lay dying. He remembered his brother's last words. Take care of them. Take care of everyone. Lakota stood up and walked back to his brother's grave. The wind had died down, and the night was quiet except for the distant sound of coyotes calling to each other across the plains. I'll take care of them, he promised the mound of earth. All of them. For as long as it takes. He didn't know then that as long as it takes would mean 10 years of his life. 10 years of watching other men marry and have families while he remained alone. 10 years of battle and blood and an ever-growing hardness in his heart. He didn't know that this vow, made in love and desperation, would nearly destroy him before it was broken by something even stronger than his promise to the spirits. But that night, all he knew was that he had chosen his path. He would be the guardian of his people, the lone wolf who protected the pack, and he would remain alone until the very last of his enemies was driven from their sacred lands. The hawk's cry echoed once more across the plains, and Lakota took it as a sign that his journey into solitude had officially begun. 10 years passed like seasons of endless winter. Lakota kept his vow, and it changed him in ways he never expected. The young man who had knelt by his brother's grave was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. The soldiers called him Ghost Walker because he appeared and disappeared like smoke. The Lakota called him Lone Wolf because he hunted without a pack. But those who knew him best just called him Lost. In the first year after his vow, Lakota threw himself into warfare with the fury of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. He learned every trail and hiding place for hundreds of miles. He could read tracks like other men read books. He knew where the supply wagons would be before the soldiers did. His raids became legendary. He would strike a military supply train in Montana and then appear 3 days later attacking a settler's wagon in Wyoming. The cavalry couldn't understand how one man could cover so much ground so quickly. They started blaming every unexplained attack on him, even ones that happened hundreds of miles apart on the same day. But Lakota wasn't working alone, not really. He had developed a network of warriors from different tribes who shared information and resources. A Cheyenne scout would tell him where the soldiers were moving. A Crow warrior, despite old tribal enemies, would warn him about ambushes. Even some Arapaho fighters joined his cause. The key to his success wasn't just skill or bravery. It was his complete lack of concern for his own survival. When a man has nothing to lose, he can take risks that would terrify others. Dakota would ride straight through enemy camps at night, counting their numbers and stealing their horses. He would walk into army forts dressed as a friendly Indian scout, gather intelligence, and walk out before anyone realized who he was. In the third year, the army put a bounty on his head. $500, dead or alive. It was more money than most soldiers saw in 2 years of service. But somehow, the closer they got to catching him, the more he seemed to slip away. The problem wasn't just that Dakota was clever. The problem was that the spirits seemed to protect him in impossible ways. Bullets would miss him by inches. His horse would stumble just as a sniper fired, causing the shot to go high. He would get lost in storms that hid his tracks from pursuing cavalry, but the protection came at a cost. Every year, Dakota became more isolated from his own people. He would visit the village only briefly, bringing supplies he had captured or information about enemy movements. Then he would disappear again into the wilderness. His mother begged him to stay longer during these visits. She could see what the lonely years were doing to him. His eyes had grown cold and distant. He rarely smiled. He spoke only when necessary, and then in short, clipped sentences like a military report. "This isn't what your brother would have wanted for you," she told him during one visit. "Mapia loved life. He would be heartbroken to see you like this." Dakota just stared at her without expression. "Mapia is dead. His wants don't matter anymore." The words cut his mother like a knife, but she tried again. "Then what about my wants?" "I want my son back. I want you to find some happiness." "Happiness is a luxury we can't afford," Dakota replied. "Not while our people are still fighting for survival." But it wasn't just his family who worried about him. Other warriors began to notice changes too. Dakota had always been brave, but now he seemed to have no fear at all. That wasn't necessarily a good thing. Fear kept warriors alive. It made them careful and smart. A man with no fear was often a dead man walking. During a raid on a supply convoy in his 4th year of solitude, Dakota did something that shocked even his allies. Instead of hitting the wagons and retreating as planned, he rode directly toward a company of 50 soldiers by himself. He had spotted a group of captured Lakota children in one of the wagons and decided to free them, no matter the cost. 20 warriors watched in amazement as one man charged an entire army unit. Dakota rode through their ranks like a whirlwind, cutting ropes and pulling children onto his horse. By the time the soldiers realized what was happening, he had rescued 6 kids and was riding away with bullets whistling around his head like angry bees. He saved those children, but he also scared his own people. That kind of courage wasn't human anymore. It was something else, something dangerous. The raids continued year after year. Dakota's reputation grew until he became more legend than man. Stories about him spread to tribes that had never seen him. Mothers told their children about the warrior who had given up love to protect his people. Young men tried to copy his tactics, usually getting themselves killed in the process. But as his reputation grew, the world around him shrank. Each year brought news of more tribes forced onto reservations, more chiefs signing treaties they didn't understand, more children taken to government schools, more sacred land sold to white settlers. By his 7th year alone, Dakota began to wonder if his vow was actually accomplishing anything. The raids hurt the army and helped individual families, but they didn't seem to be stopping the larger process of his people's destruction. If anything, his attacks gave the government excuses to crack down harder on peaceful tribes. This doubt made him even more dangerous. A warrior fighting for hope was one thing. A warrior fighting out of desperation was something else entirely. In the 8th year, something happened that almost broke his spirit completely. The government announced that all remaining free tribes had to report to reservations within 60 days, or be considered hostile. After that deadline, the army would hunt down anyone still living free, and either kill them or force them onto the reservations. Most of the remaining chiefs decided to comply. They had seen what happened to tribes that resisted too long. Their people were starving and winter was coming. The buffalo herds were nearly gone, hunted to extinction by white hunters. There seemed to be no choice left. Dakota watched as tribe after tribe gave up and walked onto the reservations. He felt like he was watching his people march into prison. But what could one man do against an entire government and army? The answer came to him during a vision quest in his 9th year. He had gone into the mountains to fast and pray, seeking guidance from the spirits. On the 3rd day, weak from hunger and thirst, he saw his brother Mapia in a dream. Mapia looked exactly as he had in life, young and strong and full of hope. "Brother," he said, "why do you punish yourself this way?" "I'm keeping my promise," Dakota replied. "I'm protecting our people. Are you?" Mapia asked. "Or are you just hiding from life because you're afraid of being hurt again?" The question hit Dakota like a physical blow. Was that what he was doing? Had his vow become less about protecting others and more about protecting himself from emotional pain? "I don't know how to live any other way now," Dakota admitted. "Then learn," Mapia said gently. "Our people need protectors, yes, but they also need hope. They need to see that life can still be good, that love can still exist even in dark times. You can't give them hope if you have none yourself." Dakota woke from the vision confused and shaken. For the first time in years, he began to question whether his path was the right one. But by then, his vow had become such a part of his identity that he didn't know how to change it. The 10th year brought the final blow. The last free tribes were forced onto Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. The Indian Wars were essentially over. The government had won not through superior fighting, but through systematic destruction of the buffalo, control of resources, and simple, overwhelming numbers. Dakota found himself in an impossible position. His vow had been to remain alone until his people were free. But his people were not free, and it was beginning to look like they never would be again. Did that mean he had to remain alone forever? The question tormented him as he made his way to Pine Ridge to be with his people in their defeat. The reservation was like a prison without walls, but it was where his family and tribe were now living. He couldn't protect them from the wilderness anymore. The new battles would be fought in different ways. As he rode toward Pine Ridge for the last time as a free man, Dakota tried to imagine what his life would be like on the reservation. The government wanted to turn all Indians into farmers and Christians. They wanted to cut his hair and make him wear white man's clothes. They wanted to give him a white man's name and a small plot of land. Most disturbing of all, they wanted to arrange marriages for young people, pairing them off according to their own ideas about who should be together. The old ways of courtship and family arrangement were being replaced by government programs designed to civilize the Indians. Dakota had no idea that this new system would soon present him with the greatest challenge of his 10-year vow. He didn't know that he was about to meet someone who would make him question everything he believed about duty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of protecting his people. All he knew was that the war was over, and somehow, despite all his efforts, his side had lost. The spirits had protected him through a decade of fighting, but they hadn't given his people victory. As he approached the reservation boundaries, Dakota wondered if the spirits had been preparing him for a different kind of battle altogether. The thought scared him more than any army ever had. Pine Ridge Reservation felt like the end of the world to Dakota. After 10 years of freedom on the open plains, being confined to a few thousand acres felt like being buried alive. The government had drawn lines on a map and said, "This is your world now. You cannot leave without permission." The reservation agent, a thin white man named William Henderson, ran the place like a small kingdom. He decided who got food rations and who went hungry. He decided which children would be sent to boarding schools. He decided who could travel and who had to stay. Most importantly, for the story that was about to unfold, he decided who would marry whom. Henderson believed that arranged marriages were the key to civilizing the Indians. He thought that if he could control how families were formed, he could control how the next generation would think. The old ways of courtship, where young people chose their own partners with family guidance, were now forbidden. Dakota arrived at Pine Ridge on a gray autumn day when the leaves were falling like tears from the trees. He barely recognized the place where his people now lived. Instead of the traditional teepees, there were rows of small wooden houses that all looked exactly the same. Instead of the organized camps arranged by family groups, everyone was scattered according to government planning. His mother had aged dramatically in the months since he'd last seen her. She now lived in one of the small government houses with Mapia's widow and her children. The house was cramped and smelled of despair, but it was better than the tents some families were still living in. "I was afraid you wouldn't come," his mother said when she saw him. "I was afraid you'd stay in the mountains forever rather than submit to this place." Dakota looked around the tiny house that was supposed to be his new home. There were 2 small rooms and a wood stove that barely provided enough heat. The walls were thin and he could hear the neighbors arguing through them. This was not a place where a man could think or find peace. "I came because you're here," he told his mother. "My family is here." But even as he said it, Dakota felt like a wild animal that had been caged. Every instinct told him to run back to the open country where he could breathe freely. Only his sense of duty kept him from mounting his horse and riding away forever. The first few weeks on the reservation were the hardest of Dakota's life. He had to register with Agent Henderson and receive an identification number. He had to promise not to leave the reservation without written permission. He had to attend meetings where government officials explained the new rules that would govern every aspect of his existence. Most painful of all, he had to watch his people struggling to adapt to a completely foreign way of life. Warriors who had once led buffalo hunts were now expected to plant corn and wheat. Women who had been masters of traditional crafts were told to learn white women's cooking and sewing. Children were forbidden to speak their own language or practice any traditional ceremonies. It was during one of these mandatory meetings that Dakota first heard about the marriage arrangements. Agent Henderson stood in front of a crowd of confused and angry Indians and announced his new policy. "The old ways of choosing spouses have led to too much disorder," Henderson declared. "From now on, all marriages will be arranged by this office according to Christian principles and civilized standards. Young people will be matched based on their education, their adoption of white customs, and their potential for productive farming." The crowd erupted in angry voices. Several elders stood up to protest, but Henderson silenced them with threats to reduce food rations. This was how things worked on the reservation. The agent held all the power, and resistance meant starvation. Among the announced engagements was one that caught Dakota's attention for reasons he couldn't explain. A young woman named Ayanna would be married to a man named Joseph Crow Feather. Joseph was a half-blood who had worked as an interpreter for the government and had adopted white ways completely. Ayanna had just returned from 10 years at a government boarding school in Pennsylvania. Dakota had never seen either of them before, but something about the announcement bothered him. Maybe it was the way Henderson described them, like they were livestock being paired for breeding. Maybe it was the fact that neither of them had been consulted about the arrangement, or maybe it was something else entirely. 3 days later, Dakota got his first glimpse of Ayanna, and everything changed. She was walking across the reservation grounds with 2 other young women, all of them dressed in the long skirts and high collars that the government required. Her hair was pinned up in the white woman style, and she carried herself with the rigid posture that the boarding schools taught. But despite all the attempts to make her look like a white woman, Ayanna moved with an unmistakable grace that spoke of her Lakota heritage. Her eyes, when they briefly met Dakota's across the dusty yard, held depths that no boarding school could erase. For the first time in 10 years, Dakota felt something stir in his chest that wasn't anger or determination. It was a warmth he had almost forgotten existed, a recognition of beauty that went beyond the physical. In that moment of eye contact, something passed between them that neither could name but both felt. Dakota quickly looked away, disturbed by his own reaction. His vow was still binding. He had promised to remain alone until his people were free, and they were certainly not free now. If anything, they were more imprisoned than ever. So why was he noticing this woman? Why did her image stay in his mind long after she had disappeared into one of the government buildings? Over the following weeks, Dakota found himself watching for Ayanna without meaning to. He learned that she worked in the reservation school, teaching younger children to read and write English. She was one of the success stories that Agent Henderson liked to point to, as proof that his civilization program was working. But Dakota began to notice things that Henderson missed. He saw how Ayanna's face would change when she thought no one was looking. He saw the sadness in her eyes when she had to correct children for speaking Lakota. He saw her pause sometimes and stare toward the hills beyond the reservation boundaries, with a longing that he recognized in his own heart. Ayanna, for her part, was very aware of the legendary warrior who had finally come to live among them. Everyone knew the story of Dakota's vow and his years of resistance. Some people whispered that he was touched by spirits, others that he was simply stubborn to the point of madness. But when Ayanna looked at him, she saw something different. She saw a man who was drowning in his own isolation but didn't know how to swim to shore. Their first actual conversation happened by accident. Dakota was visiting the trading post to buy supplies when he overheard Ayanna arguing with the store clerk in careful, controlled English. "I need fabric for winter dresses for the school children," she was saying. The material you showed me last week. That fabric is for white customers only, the clerk replied dismissively. Indians get the cheap cotton. The children will freeze in cotton when the snow comes, Ayanna said, her voice still polite but with steel underneath. They need wool. Indians should have thought about that before they decided to be Indian. The clerk laughed at his own joke. That's when Dakota stepped forward. He didn't say anything, just stood beside Ayanna and stared at the clerk with the same expression that had terrified cavalry officers for a decade. The clerk's laughter died immediately. Give her the wool, Dakota said quietly. The clerk's hands shook as he pulled down bolts of warm fabric. He didn't argue or ask for payment. He just wanted the scary Indian to go away. Outside the store, Ayanna looked up at Dakota with curiosity and gratitude. Thank you, she said. But you didn't have to do that. Children shouldn't suffer because adults are fools, Dakota replied. It was a simple exchange, but it was the beginning of something neither of them expected. Over the following weeks, they found themselves talking more often. Ayanna would ask his advice about difficult students. Dakota would bring her news from his conversations with the elders. What surprised them both was how easily they could talk to each other. Despite coming from completely different experiences, his decade in the wilderness, her decade in white schools, they understood each other in ways that seemed impossible. Ayanna told him about the boarding school, how they had tried to kill the Indian in her by forbidding everything that connected her to her heritage. She described the loneliness of being told that everything about her birth culture was savage and wrong, while never being truly accepted in white society either. Dakota found himself sharing things he had never told anyone. He talked about the weight of his vow and how it had changed him. He admitted that sometimes he wondered if his years of fighting had accomplished anything worthwhile, or if he had just been running away from the pain of his brother's death. As winter approached and Ayanna's wedding date grew closer, both of them began to realize that their conversations had become the best part of their days. They were falling in love, though neither dared to speak the word aloud. The situation was impossible on multiple levels. Ayanna was promised to another man. Dakota was bound by a sacred vow. They were both trapped in a system that gave them no choices about their own lives. But love, they were discovering, didn't care much about impossible situations. December brought the kind of cold that cut through clothes and settled in bones. On the reservation, people huddled around their small stoves and tried to make their government rations last until the next distribution. But for Dakota and Ayanna, the approaching winter was nothing compared to the ice that was forming around their hearts. With only days left before the wedding, their stolen conversations had become both more precious and more painful. They met in secret now, careful to avoid the eyes of Agent Henderson and the other officials who watched everything that happened on the reservation. Their favorite meeting place was the old root cellar behind the abandoned trading post. It had been built by the previous Indian agent and forgotten when Henderson took over. Inside, surrounded by empty shelves and the smell of dried earth, they could speak freely without fear of being overheard. Tell me about your dreams, Dakota said one evening as snow howled outside their hiding place. They sat across from each other on old crates, sharing the warmth of a small candle Ayanna had brought. My dreams. She laughed, but there was sadness in it. I stopped having dreams when I was 7 years old and they took me to the boarding school. That's not true, Dakota said gently. I've seen your face when you look toward the hills. I've heard the longing in your voice when you talk about the old stories. You still dream. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, studying the candle flame. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I dream about a teepee made of white buffalo hide, she said. I dream about children who speak Lakota as their first language and learn English only because it's useful, not because their own language is forbidden. I dream about a man who knows the old songs and can teach them to those children. She looked up at Dakota, and in the candlelight, he could see tears in her eyes. I dream about being touched by someone who sees me, not just the education the white schools gave me or the useful wife I could become. I dream about love that doesn't have to be hidden or apologized for. Dakota felt something break loose in his chest, a dam that had been holding back 10 years of carefully controlled emotions. Ayanna, don't, she said quickly. Don't say anything that will make this harder than it already is. But Dakota couldn't stop himself. The words had been building inside him for weeks, and now they poured out like water through a broken dam. I dream about you every night, he said. I dream about what it would be like to wake up beside you every morning. I dream about teaching our children to hunt and track, while you teach them to read and think. I dream about growing old with you, about facing whatever comes next together instead of alone. The tears spilled over and ran down Ayana's cheeks. We can't have those dreams, she whispered. Why not? Dakota asked, though he knew the answer. Because you made a vow that you can't break. Because I'm promised to another man. Because we live in a world that doesn't care what we want. Dakota reached across the space between them and gently wiped the tears from her face. It was the first time he had touched her, and the contact sent electricity through both of them. What if I could break the vow? He asked. Could you? After 10 years? After everything you've sacrificed? It was the question that had been tormenting Dakota for weeks. His vow had been made to the spirits, witnessed by the tribal elders, sealed by the sign of the red-tailed hawk. Such promises weren't broken lightly. In traditional Lakota belief, breaking a sacred vow could bring terrible consequences not just to the person who made it, but to their entire family and tribe. But there was something else troubling him, something he had only recently begun to understand. I've been thinking about why I really made that vow, he said slowly. I told everyone it was to protect our people. I told myself it was what the spirits wanted. But what if it was really just fear? Fear of what? Fear of loving someone and losing them the way I lost Mapia. Fear of having children who might die in a war or be taken to boarding schools. Fear of opening my heart and having it broken again. Ayana studied his face in the candlelight. She could see the truth in his eyes, the recognition of something he had been hiding from himself for a decade. If that's true, she said carefully, then maybe your vow has already served its purpose. Maybe it protected you until you were strong enough to love again. The idea was revolutionary to Dakota. Could it be that simple? Could 10 years of isolation and warfare have been preparation for this moment? This choice, this woman? But what about you? He asked, and what about Joseph? Ayana's face hardened. Joseph is a good man, but he doesn't see me. When he looks at me, he sees a successful product of the white education system. He sees someone who can help him fit into the white world. He sees a useful partner for his plans to become a successful farmer and businessman. That's not love, Dakota said. No, it's not. But it's what's expected. It's what Agent Henderson wants, what the government wants. An orderly arrangement that serves their purposes. They sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. Outside, the wind had died down and the reservation was settling into the deep quiet of a winter night. There's something I need to tell you, Ayana said finally. Something I've never told anyone. Dakota waited, sensing that whatever she was about to share would be important. When I was at the boarding school, they told me my family was dead. They said there had been a disease and everyone from my village had died. They said I was lucky to be safe at the school, that I had no home to return to. Dakota felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. But that wasn't true. No. I found out the truth when I turned 18 and they had to release me. My parents and younger brother are alive. They're here on the reservation in a little house near the northern boundary. I've seen them, but I haven't spoken to them. Why not? Ayana's voice broke. Because I don't know how. They speak Lakota, and I can barely understand it anymore. They live the old way as much as they can, and I don't remember how to do that. I spent 10 years being told that everything about my heritage was wrong and savage. Even though I know better now, I still feel like a stranger in my own family. Dakota understood. He had seen this before. The cruel effectiveness of the boarding school system. Take children away young enough. Keep them long enough, and they became strangers to their own people. That's another reason why this marriage to Joseph makes sense, Ayana continued. He's like me, caught between two worlds. At least with him, I won't have to pretend to be something I'm not. But you'd be settling for understanding instead of love, Dakota pointed out. Maybe understanding is enough. Maybe love is a luxury people like us can't afford. Dakota stood up abruptly, suddenly angry, not at Ayana, but at the whole system that had brought them to this impossible situation. No, he said firmly. Love is not a luxury. Love is what makes survival worthwhile. Without love, we're just going through the motions of living. He began pacing the small space, his mind racing. They want us to accept arrangements instead of choice. They want us to be grateful for understanding instead of demanding passion. They want us to settle for safe instead of fighting for what our hearts truly want. But fighting means risking everything, Ayana said. Your vow, my security, both our places in this community. Maybe that's exactly what we need to risk, Dakota replied. Maybe that's what the spirits have been preparing us for. As if summoned by his words, they heard a sound outside that made them both freeze. It was the cry of a hawk, piercing and clear in the cold night air. In December, in this weather, hawks should have been roosting quietly, not flying and calling. Dakota and Ayana looked at each other with wide eyes. They both knew what the hawk's cry meant in Lakota tradition. It was a sign from the spirits, a message that something important was about to happen. Did you hear that? Ayana whispered. Yes, Dakota said. The spirits are speaking. They blew out the candle and slipped outside into the snowy night. Above them, barely visible against the dark sky, a red-tailed hawk circled 3 times before disappearing toward the hills. It was the same sign that had appeared the night Dakota made his vow 10 years earlier. The same bird, or one very much like it, had come to witness this moment of decision. Standing there in the snow, looking up at the empty sky where the hawk had been, Dakota felt something shift inside him. The ice that had formed around his heart during 10 years of isolation was beginning to crack. The wedding is in 3 days, Ayana said quietly. I know, Dakota replied. After that, we can't see each other anymore. It wouldn't be right. I know that too. So what do we do? Dakota looked at her. This woman who had appeared in his life like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying. She was shivering in the cold, but her eyes were steady and strong. She was waiting for him to choose, to decide whether love was worth risking everything they had built to protect themselves. I need one more night to think, he said. One more night to pray and seek guidance. And then I'll give you my answer. Before the wedding. Before it's too late to change anything. They walked back toward the settlement together, careful to take different paths so no one would see them arriving together. But as they parted, Ayana caught Dakota's hand for just a moment. Whatever you decide, she said, know that these past weeks have been the happiest of my life since I was 7 years old. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, with frost covering everything like a blanket of tiny diamonds. Inside the small mission church that Agent Henderson had built at the center of Pine Ridge, people gathered for what was supposed to be a celebration, but felt more like a funeral. Dakota sat in the back row, watching as friends and family filled the wooden pews. Many of them looked uncomfortable in the unfamiliar setting. This wasn't how weddings were supposed to happen in Lakota tradition. There should have been days of ceremony, gift exchanges between families, traditional songs and dances. Instead, there was this rushed foreign ritual designed to satisfy government requirements rather than honor cultural traditions. At the front of the church, Joseph Crowfeather waited nervously for his bride. He was a decent man caught in the same impossible system as everyone else. Dakota felt no anger toward him, only sadness for all of them trapped in circumstances none of them had chosen. Ayana entered wearing a white dress that Agent Henderson had ordered from a catalog in Chicago. It was beautiful in its way, but it made her look like a stranger to herself. Her hair was pinned up elaborately, her face was pale with powder, and her movements were careful and controlled. She looked like a China doll someone had dressed up to play a role, but Dakota could see past the costume to the real woman underneath. He could see the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes avoided looking at the gathered crowd, the barely controlled sadness that she wore like a shadow. The missionary, a thin man named Reverend Williams, began the ceremony with a long prayer in English that most of the Lakota guests couldn't understand. He talked about Christian marriage and civilized behavior and the importance of abandoning heathen ways. Every word felt like a small violence against everything Dakota's people held sacred. As the Reverend droned on, Dakota closed his eyes and tried to connect with the spirits one last time. He had spent the entire night in prayer and meditation, seeking guidance about what he should do. The answer had come to him just before dawn, in a vision that left him shaken and amazed. In the vision, he had seen his brother Mapia standing by a river that flowed between two worlds. Mapia looked exactly as he had in life, but there was a peace in his eyes that he had never possessed during his time on Earth. "Brother," Mapia had said, "why do you carry my death like a stone in your heart?" "Because you died protecting others," Dakota replied. "Because you sacrificed everything for our people." "Yes," Mapia agreed. "And now you want to do the same. But tell me, what good is protection without hope? What good is sacrifice without love? I don't understand. Mapia smiled, and it was like seeing the sun rise after a long night. I died so that children could live. But what kind of life is it if those children grow up believing that love is selfish, that happiness is wrong, that connection with others is a weakness to be avoided? But your vow served its purpose. It kept you alive through the worst years. It focused your strength when our people needed a protector. But the time for that kind of protection is over. Now our people need something else. What do they need? They need to see that love is still possible. They need to see that happiness can still be found, even in the darkest circumstances. They need to see that choosing hope over fear is not betrayal but courage. Lakota had awakened from the vision with tears on his face and a clarity in his heart that he hadn't felt in 10 years. His brother was right. The vow that had once served to protect his people was now preventing him from giving them something they needed, even more than protection. Now, sitting in the mission church and watching the woman he loved about to marry another man, Lakota knew what he had to do. The knowledge terrified him and thrilled him in equal measure. Reverend Williams reached the traditional part of the ceremony. If anyone here has any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. The words hung in the air like a challenge. In all his years performing weddings, Reverend Williams had never actually expected anyone to speak up at this point. It was just a formality, a leftover from older traditions. But traditions, Lakota had learned, sometimes contained more wisdom than people realized. He stood up. The sound of his movement seemed as loud as thunder in the quiet church. Every head turned toward him. He could see shock on his mother's face, confusion in Joseph's eyes, and something that might have been hope flickering in Ayana's expression. I object, Lakota said clearly. Agent Henderson jumped to his feet. Sit down. You have no right to disrupt this ceremony. But Lakota ignored him. He had faced down cavalry charges and survived 10 years in the wilderness. One angry government agent held no terror for him. 10 years ago, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the church, I made a vow to remain alone until my people were free. I have kept that vow through a decade of war and struggle. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Everyone knew the story of Lakota's vow, but no one had expected him to break it here now in such a public way. But I was wrong about what freedom means, Lakota continued. I thought freedom was the absence of enemies. I thought it was the ability to live without fear of attack. I thought it was returning to the old ways exactly as they were before the white man came. He began walking slowly toward the front of the church, his eyes fixed on Ayana. I understand now that true freedom is the courage to choose love over fear. True freedom is the strength to build something new from the ashes of what was lost. True freedom is refusing to let our enemies' hatred turn us into people who are afraid to hope. Agent Henderson was sputtering with rage. This is outrageous. I'll have you arrested. I'll have you thrown off the reservation. Lakota stopped in front of the altar and looked directly at Henderson. 10 years without a woman, he said, his voice carrying the weight of every lonely night, every battle fought alone, every moment of connection he had denied himself. That was my sacrifice for my people. But I will not sacrifice love itself. That would be giving our enemies the final victory. He turned to face Ayana, who was staring at him with wide eyes and parted lips. I love you, he said simply. I love your strength and your intelligence and your courage. I love the way you care for children who aren't your own. I love the way you hold on to hope even when the world tries to steal it from you. I love the woman you are, not the woman they tried to make you into. Tears were streaming down Ayana's face now, washing away the powder and leaving her looking more like herself than she had all morning. If you'll have me, Lakota continued, I want to marry you the right way, not as an arrangement made by government agents, but as a choice made by two people who see each other clearly and choose to face whatever comes next together. The church erupted in chaos. Some people were shouting support. Others were expressing shock and dismay. Agent Henderson was ordering the tribal police to arrest Lakota. Reverend Williams was calling for order and invoking the authority of Christian marriage law. But through it all, Lakota and Ayana looked only at each other. What about your vow? She asked, her voice barely audible above the noise. My vow was to protect my people, Lakota replied. I think the best way to protect them now is to show them that love is still possible. Joseph Crowfeather, who had been standing frozen in shock, suddenly stepped forward. For a moment, Dakota thought the man might challenge him or demand satisfaction according to white customs. Instead, Joseph looked at Ayanna with sad but understanding eyes. "He's right," Joseph said quietly. "This isn't love we're about to promise each other. It's just arrangement, convenience, a way to satisfy the agent's requirements." He turned to Dakota. "She's yours if she'll have you. She always was. From the moment you two started looking at each other like the rest of the world had disappeared." Ayanna looked back and forth between the two men, then at the chaos surrounding them. Agent Henderson was still shouting orders. The tribal police were moving toward Dakota, but seemed reluctant to actually arrest him. The congregation was divided between those calling for respect for tradition and those supporting this dramatic declaration of love. And in that moment of chaos and noise and conflict, Ayanna made her choice. She stepped forward, took Dakota's face in her hands, and kissed him. It was a kiss that contained 10 years of loneliness, weeks of forbidden connection, and a lifetime of hope for the future. It was a kiss that said yes to love and no to fear. It was a kiss that claimed him as much as he was claiming her. When they finally broke apart, the church had gone completely silent. Even Agent Henderson had stopped shouting, perhaps recognizing that he was witnessing something beyond his authority to control. Old Chayton, the eldest of the tribal council, slowly stood up in his pew. His weathered face was thoughtful as he studied the couple at the front of the church. "A vow made in pain," he said in Lakota, his voice carrying clearly in the silence, "can be broken by love without dishonoring the spirits. The hawk has given its sign. The heart has made its choice." Other elders began nodding agreement. They had seen the signs too. The hawk's appearance, the timing, the courage it had taken for both Dakota and Ayanna to risk everything for love. Agent Henderson made one last attempt to regain control. "This is illegal. The marriage arrangements have been officially recorded. You can't just